dive today. We're going to be digging into the nervous system and trauma and sensory processing.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff.
You guys gave us some pretty interesting sources this time. We've got a chart on the polyvagal theory, a whole scientific paper, and even a presentation on sensory regulation. This will be good.
Definitely lots to unpack there.
For sure. Let's kick things off with this polyvagal theory chart. Have you seen this thing? It's like it visually lays out how our nervous systems react when we feel threatened, which I think we can all relate to, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So it basically breaks it down into three main states: social engagement, fight or flight, and shutdown.
And it's interesting how they've arranged it on here visually because it shows this sort of like curve, right?
Like a roadmap.
Yeah. So when you're in that social engagement zone, think like you're feeling safe, connected, you're relaxed, you're digesting your food properly, you're able to have a nice calm conversation, your body's happy. But then as we move along the chart, as that sense of danger increases.
Our bodies are like, hold on.
Exactly. It takes us up into that fight or flight.
Which I'm sure a lot of us have felt that. That's that surge of energy where your heart starts pounding, you're breathing faster, and you're laser focused on either fighting off whatever that threat is or, getting out of there.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where like evolution comes in, right? These responses are ancient. They developed over millions of years to keep us safe from predators and dangers. It's fascinating.
Wow. So our bodies are like hardwired.
Hardwired, yes.
So it's like even when we're not consciously thinking about it, our nervous system is always kind of scanning for those cues, for danger, right?
Yeah, constantly. It's called neuroception, this like subconscious process of evaluating for safety and danger.
It's wild. It's like a sixth sense almost.
It really is. And so when it senses that danger, bam, fight or flight kicks in. But then if for some reason running or fighting isn't an option, that's when we see that shift on the chart into shutdown, which is kind of like the body's last resort when it senses a life or death situation.
So what happens in shutdown? I'm a little scared to ask.
So instead of that burst of energy you get with fight or flight, shutdown is almost the opposite. The chart mentions like freezing, numbness, even dissociation.
Oh, wow. So it's like the body just completely shuts down.
It's like playing dead, right? It's a way of trying to stay safe when all else fails.
It's a lot to think about that our body could just go through all of those different stages.
Right. And what's so important to remember here is that everyone's nervous system is unique, right?
Yeah.
What sends one person into fight or flight might trigger shutdown in another.
That's a good point. It's different for everybody.
And this variability is super important when we start talking about how trauma impacts people differently.
That makes sense.
Because it's not a one-size-fits-all response.
Okay, so we've got this like roadmap of how the nervous system reacts to threat, but where does trauma really come into all of this?
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting about this paper we've got here.
Yeah, I was curious about this too.
It really digs into that connection. And what's so powerful is that it emphasizes that not everyone responds to trauma in the same way.
Interesting. So we were just talking about how trauma can show up so differently for everyone, right?
Yeah, and how it really gets like embedded in our nervous systems.
Right. So what's actually going on in our bodies and minds when we experience something traumatic?
Well, one way to think about it is to imagine your nervous system like a smoke detector, right?
Okay.
Trauma can make that smoke detector like super sensitive. So now it's going off even when there's just a little bit of smoke or even just steam.
Oh, wow. So it's like always on high alert.
Exactly. Like it gets kind of stuck in that on position.
So then things that wouldn't normally be threatening, like suddenly feel really scary, right?
Yeah.
Like going back to that airplane example, maybe a bumpy car ride, which most people wouldn't even think twice about.
Right.
Could trigger that same panic as the plane turbulence did for someone who experienced trauma in the air.
Absolutely. And that's where it gets even more complex, because the person who's experiencing that fear response, they might not even consciously connect it back to that past trauma.
Right. They might not put two and two together.
Yeah, they just feel this wave of anxiety or fear that seemingly comes out of nowhere, right?
And then that's when we start creating narratives, I think, in our minds to try to make sense of those feelings.
Oh, absolutely. We're always trying to make sense of things.
The paper mentions how these narratives, even if they don't logically line up with what's happening, they can help explain why some people with trauma histories might avoid social situations or have trouble connecting with others.
Right, because their nervous system is constantly on the lookout for those threats, even when there's no real danger present.
Wow.
It's exhausting, right?
Yeah, it sounds exhausting.
And often the easiest way to manage those really intense feelings is to kind of avoid anything that might trigger them.
It's like your body's trying to protect you, even if it doesn't always make sense.
Exactly, it's a protection mechanism. And that's actually why it's so important to approach like trauma from this nervous system perspective,
So
right?
it's not about judging whether something was traumatic enough. It's about
About.
understanding how that event, big or small, impacted a person's nervous system.
Exactly, because everyone's experience is valid.
This is all so insightful. So knowing all of this, what are some practical takeaways? I mean, obviously the paper focuses on therapy settings, but is there anything in here we can, actually use in everyday life?
Absolutely.
I was wondering that.
Because, well, it does highlight the way that therapists, are using this in clinical settings. The insights are so relevant for everybody.
Oh, good.
It's really all about understanding how to create a sense of safety and how to regulate your nervous system, both for yourself and others.
So it's less about the therapist's office and more about how we navigate the world with this new understanding.
Exactly. And, the paper actually talks about three main, let's call them polyvagal informed strategies that therapists use.
So what's the first one?
So the first one is all about minimizing cues of danger, which we were kind of talking about earlier, like those loud, low-frequency sounds that can trigger a threat response.
Right.
Opting for calmer environments, especially if you know you're prone to feeling overwhelmed, I think that can make a huge difference.
That makes sense. What about the second strategy?
So the second strategy kind of builds on that and focuses on actively increasing cues of safety.
So not just about avoiding things that make you feel unsafe, but surrounding yourself with things that help you feel grounded.
Yeah. Think like soft lighting, calming music, minimizing visual clutter. The paper talks about how therapists often use these types of strategies to kind of create a sense of safety in their offices.
Like a little sanctuary for your nervous system.
Exactly, a sanctuary. I like that.
Okay, so we've got minimizing danger cues
Yeah.
and then maximizing those safety cues. What about that third one?
So the third one, and this is a big one, is about re-engaging that social engagement system.
Okay.
So that's the system that helps us feel connected and safe and trusting with others.
Which makes a lot of sense, but how do we actually do that?
Yeah.
Especially if trauma has made it, hard to trust or connect with people.
Yeah, that's the hard part. But the paper talks about how therapists do this through something called attunement, which is basically just paying really close attention to their clients, both verbal and nonverbal cues.
So how they're saying things, their tone of voice, but also their body language.
Exactly. And then using their own tone of voice and facial expressions to convey empathy and understanding. So it creates this feedback loop.
A feedback loop.
Yeah, because if you think about it, when someone feels truly heard and understood, their nervous system is more likely to relax, right? They come out of that fight or flight or shutdown mode.
It's like that feeling of okay, I'm safe with this person.
Exactly, exactly. And so while that really deep level of attunement is essential in therapy, I think the principles can be applied in our everyday interactions as well, right?
So being mindful of our tone of voice, really paying attention to, how people are saying things, their body language, those small things can make a difference.
They really can.
It's about helping others feel safe and regulated too, not just ourselves.
Yes, exactly. It's about creating an environment of co-regulation where everyone feels comfortable enough to kind of let their guard down and connect, which is tough,
Like you said before, connection over correction.
Yes. Instead of trying to fix someone's behavior, we can offer support.
This has been so helpful, but we haven't even gotten to that sensory regulation presentation yet, and it's full of amazing insights.
Yeah.
They dive into these different sensory processing styles and then how to figure out your own. And
Oh, it's fascinating stuff. And a lot of it ties in directly with what we've been talking about, with creating safety and regulation.
yeah, that's awesome. Let's jump into it, Ben. So this is sensory regulation presentation. It talks about these different sensory processing patterns: bystander, seeker, sensor, and avoider. And what I thought was really cool, they use these examples, these people to illustrate each pattern: Robin, Lynn, Sam, and Gary, which makes it so much easier to kind of wrap your head around.
Absolutely, because it makes it so much more relatable.
Right. So it's not just theory. We actually see these patterns playing out.
Yeah, in real people.
Okay, so let's start with Robin. Robin is all about that intense sensory experience. Think rock climbing, loud music, adventurous eating. The presentation calls this the seeker pattern.
So, as the name suggests, this pattern is all about actively seeking out sensory stimulation.
They can't get enough.
Yeah, people like Robin, they often have a very high threshold for sensory input, meaning it takes a lot to overwhelm them.
So they're kind of like sensory adventurers in a way.
Exactly, always looking to fill up that sensory gas tank, so to speak.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have Lynn. Lynn embodies the bystander pattern, which the presentation describes as someone who might seem a little detached or under-responsive to their surroundings.
It's almost like they miss cues that other people might pick up on really easily.
Right, like they're not quite all there.
Yeah, and it's not intentional, it's just...
It's just how they process things.
Exactly, they just need a little extra stimulation to really engage.
Then we have Sam, who represents the sensor pattern. So Sam is incredibly perceptive. They pick up on those little details that other people miss.
They notice everything.
But on the flip side, that also means they can be extra sensitive to things like bright lights, strong smells, or loud noises.
Remember that example from the presentation about the itchy sweater?
Oh yeah, that was a good one.
That's such a classic sensor experience.
It's like they're just so aware of like every single sensation.
Right, but they might not always actively try to change it or remove themselves from that situation, you know.
It's just how they experience the world. And then finally, we've got Jerry, who exemplifies the avoider pattern. Jerry is like easily overwhelmed by sensory input.
They're very sensitive, and
Yeah.
they might avoid situations that could be overstimulating for them.
Makes sense.
Right, like covering their ears when the music's too loud, or, sticking to familiar foods, or even just needing a lot of predictability in their routine.
It's like their nervous system is just like, too much.
Exactly. It's on high alert.
So it sounds like, the biggest takeaway here is just understanding these patterns, right? Like not just in ourselves, but in, our loved ones, our coworkers, even strangers.
Absolutely, because it can really help you build more supportive and compassionate relationships.
It's about recognizing that we all kind of experience the world in different ways,
Yeah.
and what feels just right for one person might feel completely overwhelming or even underwhelming for someone else.
And that's where this whole idea of optimal levels of arousal comes in, right?
Yeah, the presentation talks about that.
Because we all have that sweet spot, where we feel alert and engaged, but not overly stimulated.
There we're like, all right, we're good. We're in the zone.
Yes, exactly. But that's going to be different for everyone based on their sensory processing style. And that's why I think self-awareness is so crucial.
Totally, yeah. Because once you understand what your triggers are,
Yeah.
then you can start to make choices that support you, right?
Yes, and the presentation actually gives some great strategies for that, like using weighted blankets, fidget toys, taking movement breaks. There are all these different things you can experiment with.
So it's about advocating for your own sensory needs,
Exactly.
which I think is a perfect place to kind of wrap up our deep dive today, don't you think?
I think so.
We've learned so much. We've talked about how our nervous systems react to threat, how trauma can impact that, the different sensory processing styles. There's just so much to think about.
And remember, this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
It always is.
Right. There's a whole universe of knowledge out there about the nervous system, trauma, and sensory processing. Keep asking those questions.
Keep learning.
And, keep sharing this knowledge with others.
Because the more we understand ourselves and each other, the better equipped we are to navigate the world, right?
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, on that note, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone.